Hey, good morning. This is Pastor Jason Abbott coming to you from my home for this video Bible teaching. Um, as a lot of churches have done, we've suspended services at this point in time to kind of get ahead of this thing with the virus and try and prevent any kind of spread. So that's what we're doing right now, and so we're just going to basically pick up from where we left off in our sermon series. Could you turn the music down? My wife likes to listen to Skinner, so it's just... Yes, please. Okay, I'm joking. She doesn't. But anyways, it's a different environment coming to you from my home. And so, anyways, a couple things. Our series was called Living in a Crazy, Mixed Up, Unpredictable World. And as you can tell, in the past few weeks, things just got crazier and more mixed up and more unpredictable. And so we're adjusting to those things, and so we're just continuing with that sermon series, and it becomes even more relevant with the times that we're looking at right now. Where we left off, and I'll just briefly go into these things, was we talked first off about the necessity of prayer, and that in crazy, mixed up, unpredictable times, for you to remain strong in your faith, you are going to have to be a person of prayer. You need that process of exercising your faith. You need that process to where it reminds you of who you are in Christ, and it also reminds you who God is. And so prayer functions in that way and is a great benefit. And we looked at the parable of the widow and the judge as our reference point. After that, we looked at a different kind of perspective and said, well, it's a crazy, mixed up, unpredictable world, and people in that world, people that are far from God, well, they don't see things the way we do. And we have to understand that they're not going to do what God says until they see as God sees, until they have His perspective. And so we shouldn't be surprised that they scoff, or they turn away, or they reject. It shouldn't really surprise us. They're not going to do as God says until they see as God sees. And our point of reference for that came from Old Testament story about Naaman, the great military leader that came to Israel to try and be healed of leprosy. So anyways, that was what we've been talking about. And today, we're going to be talking about our responsibility for the world we live in, because we have a certain responsibility. I was kind of reminded of that the other day when I was watching the Tom Hanks movie, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. Maybe you saw it. Anyways, it's a pretty good movie. But one thing that came out very clear was that Mr. Rogers had a very strong sense of his responsibility to teach children how to deal with their emotions. And his commitment to that, his motivation for that, his lifelong legacy for doing that is what his TV show was all about. And that just came through in a big way. Now that's a very specific sense of responsibility. We're going to be approaching the subject on a broader sense today, but that's our area of focus, our responsibility in the world. So if you have a Bible, or you're looking online, or some other kind of way, an iPad or a phone, whatever, you can pull up the verses. We're going to be looking into the Old Testament for our point of reference today. So you'll be in the Old Testament, and you'll be in 2 Kings. Second Kings. Can you read that okay? Okay. 2 Kings. And once you flip over to that, keep going till you get all the way to chapter 7. So 2 Kings chapter 7. Now, where we're picking up in the narrative and what's going on at this point in time, this is roughly, just to give you an idea, this is roughly about 800 BC. And so this is almost a millennium before the birth of Christ. So this is ancient upon ancient. You know, this is very far back. And so what we're talking about here is a point in time where a man named Elisha, who's a prophet, and if you're not really sure what a prophet is, you know, it's not just somebody who tells the future. Think of it like this: it's a prophet is somebody who enforces the terms of the covenant. And so the prophets were largely approaching the kings and the leaders and the elders and all that, you know, kind of, you know, waking them up and accusing them and challenging them and getting in their face and whatever they had to do to make sure that they understood that they had a covenant that they needed to live up to. And so they were enforcing the terms of the covenant. And so if they wanted to receive the blessings that God offered, they needed to get their act together. And so Elisha was the guy at this point in time. Well, what's going on in the history right now of Israel is that this large city, Samaria, is surrounded. And the Syrians have basically besieged the city. Okay? They've besieged the city, they've surrounded it, and they're basically starving it into submission. They've got lots of supplies, they've got lots of troops, they've got lots of ability, and they are just going to wear the city down until there's nothing but starving people to surrender. And that's the plan. And it's working pretty well. People are very desperate. There's a lot of anxiety. People are starving. There's even a report in here about the incident of cannibalism. So you can imagine it's gone to the farthest extreme. So there is a sense of desperation and panic and anxiety in this city that you know is hard to imagine. But it's not that far off from what we're dealing with right now, because people do get in a panic, and people do feel distressed, and people do feel the weight of the current circumstances, and you know they don't know what's coming next, and they don't even know how they'll deal with it. And so that point of desperation is, I think, something we can touch on with the storyline. So this is what that city's going through. Well, probably the only thing worse than being a Jew in Samaria, surrounded at this point, probably the only thing worse would be a leper at that city. Because the lepers were pushed out of the city, and they're living outside the city, right outside the gates. And they're kind of outcasts. They've got this, you know, wasting disease that they're dealing with. And that's probably the only thing worse than being inside the city and starving. Well, our storyline picks up with kind of focusing in on four guys. We don't know their names. But these four lepers are looking at their situation, and they're seeing just things within the city and outside the city just get worse and worse and worse. And it's more stressful, and it's more panicky, and it's more desperate, and it's more frightening, and it's just, you know, it's just continuing. And so these four guys, these lepers, they decide, you know, we should do something. We are running out of options. Because here's what we see. This is their kind of thought process. If we stay where we're at, then we're going to starve just like everybody else in this city and around this city. We're going to starve. It's just going to happen. There's no food. It's inevitable. Well, what if we go over to the Syrian camp out there in the distance surrounding Samaria? What if we go over to that camp and surrender and just beg and hope that they have pity on us, because we're lepers? We don't, pose any threat to them. Maybe they will have pity on us, and then we'll live. But if we go over to that camp and they see us and they despise us and kill us, well, we were going to die anyways, sticking around with this city. And so they're looking at, behind door number 1 and behind door number 2 and behind door number 3, and they're looking and they just, that they don't see a lot of good options, but they're willing to try something. And so they collectively decide to make their way over to the Syrian camp. And this is where we'll pick up. So if you have your Bibles and you're following along, you're at chapter 7 of 2 Kings, and it says in verse 5, it says, "And so the lepers, they arose at twilight, to go to the camp of the Syrians. And when they had come to the outskirts of the Syrian camp, to their surprise, no one was there. For the Lord had caused the army of the Syrians to hear the noise of chariots and the noise of horses and the noise of a great army. And so they said to one another, Look, the king of Israel has hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians to attack us. And therefore," this is verse 7, "they arose and fled at twilight and left the camp intact, their tents, their horses, their donkeys, and they fled for their lives." So, the siege of the city, you have this massive camp and this massive army surrounding this city, keeping anything from coming in and out of the city. And so they're well fortified. I mean, if, as an army, if you're going to siege a city, well, you have to be well supplied, because you're waiting out the city to surrender. And so you have to have plenty of supplies, you have to have good supply lines, you have to have plenty of food, plenty of resources. You have to be well stocked to pull that off, because you're waiting them out. Well, these 4 lepers, they make their way to that camp, and no one's there. No one's there at all. And, what God has done is so interesting, because, He had caused their imagination to just create so much fear that they weren't even going to fight. They were just going to run. And so they leave everything, because they are at the point where they think that they're just going to be overrun by a massive army, and they just need to just run for their lives. Well, the lepers fall into this, and then all of a sudden, they see what they have, and then I'll pick up reading, and it says, let's see. It says, "And when the lepers came to the outskirts of the camp, they went into one tent and ate and drank and carried from it silver and gold and clothing and went and hid them. And then they came back and entered another tent and carried some more from there and also went and hid it." And so they're basically doing this again and again and again, taking advantage of this massive resource that they now have. They're eating, they're drinking, they're just enjoying everything, and then they're hiding some for a rainy day. And so then they go back to another tent and they do it all over again. But, and you can kind of see where this is going. There's a city starving. There's a city being devastated. There's a city in panic. There's a city that is falling apart. And they're eating and drinking and having a big time. And just going from tent to tent. In that city. The city doesn't even know that the siege is basically over. This city doesn't know that it's finished. This is time to celebrate. The city doesn't even know. But in the night, these 4 lepers are just having a big time. Well, they do think about that. Verse 9 says, "Then they said to one another, 'We are not doing right. This day is a day of good news, and we remain silent. If we wait until morning light, some punishment will come upon us.'" See, they are thinking about it after a while, and they said, "You know what? We're not doing right. We've got this great news. We know that the siege is over. We know that this camp is left here, just well stocked with all kinds of food and animals and all this other kind of stuff. And we know the secret. And we're not sharing that with anybody." And over in the distance, that city is starving. And he says, we keep this to ourselves, and somebody finds out about it, we'll be punished. Because we should be sharing this. Well, when we're talking about our responsibility, I hope you can see the application. Our responsibility to the world is to point them to Jesus. Because just like with these men, we have a responsibility to share what we have found. You need to share what you have found. You've got great news. You've got something to point people to of hope. You have something to point people to that goes beyond the trials and problems of this world. You've got something special. You've got the gospel. You've got good news. And that city and those people and those relatives and those co-workers and those neighbors and whoever else, they're living in a desperate world. They're far from God. And so what we're called to do, our responsibility, is we have to share what we found. We have to share what we have found, just like the lepers in the story. Because we stumbled upon this. We didn't, our salvation was not dependent on us. We did not earn it. It's all through Christ. And so, just like God was solely responsible for clearing out those Syrians and sending them home, He was solely responsible for our salvation. And so, we need to point people to Jesus. Now that doesn't mean, I'm going to have to, memorize 7 verses out of Romans or, go to EE training or something like that. You can just share your testimony. Just point people to Jesus. Let them know where your hope comes from. And the more you do that, the more you'll be like them. Because you do not want to remain silent. Let me read this to you one more time. "And then they said to one another, 'We are not doing right. This day is a day of good news, and we remain silent. Let's not remain silent. Let's share what we have found. Because it's time to celebrate. And bring people who are far from God, point them to Jesus. Because he is the salvation of the world. So have a good day.